feel
Yeah,
like
it's
I
so played
hear
out.
much more often the sort of this like the recognition that there's a need for a portfolio of solutions. We do often like to say like the research and development is done on nature, right? Like millions
Yes,
of years
millions of
have
years
gone
of
into
proven
photosynthesis.
scientific data.
Yes,
Exactly.
that if you described it as like, wow, there's this machine that can use sunlight and water and air to like suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it into relatively long-lived stores.
They can do
For
so
like
really cheaply
very
and,
cheaply, exactly.
yeah, and you don't even have to build it. It builds
It
itself
builds
from
itself,
from a
yeah, it's
genetic blueprint. It's
self-replicating.
amazing.
Yeah, you would be like, "Oh my gosh, like, I wanna invest in this machine," and you're like, "Oh, it's the
Exactly,
tree outside your window," and people are like, "Oh, all
exactly.
right." We take it for granted.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. My name is Rene Velasquez, and I'm happy to be your host again for this episode. I've got a very special guest with me, Dr. Susan Cook-Patton, with me from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with you, Susan. Thank you for making the time. Can I ask you, essentially, what have you spent the last couple of years of your life effectively doing, understanding, studying, and sharing with the world? Tell us
Well,
about yourself.
I'll go back a decade, which is when I started at the Nature Conservancy, and I got my job for what is actually probably a pretty boring reason, but there was a study that came out that found all the different ways that we could work with nature to help tackle climate change, which is exciting. But the boring part was that the biggest bar in the main figure was reforestation, and the uncertainty around that bar was huge. It was like so big that they actually drew a little star at the end, and they're like, the uncertainty
Really?
shoots way off over here. So that's what I've been spending the last decade of my life of trying to reduce our uncertainty around how can we use what I like to say, putting trees back into the ground, reforestation, agroforestry, plantation. How can we use that as a climate solution? How much carbon can we get depending on where we are and what we do? And really just trying to narrow the decision space and help people make decisions faster and feel more confident in the outcomes of their choices about using forest as a climate solution.
Great. Love that. And it's not boring. It's very not only relevant, but it's super interesting. Obviously, from our perspective, we're practitioners in this market from the trading side. So we'll ultimately come in right downstream once projects have been implemented, have gone through the full validation verification process, and ultimately are certified. And then interact as the intermediary layer, essentially working with the buyers who are then trying to identify which are the projects that are the ones that they want to incorporate into their portfolio, let's say investable. But there's so much more that goes on upstream. Talk to us about the day-to-day work that you're doing at TNC, because it's an incredibly large organization with a really wide breadth. I'm a huge fan of many of your colleagues. Kelly Hamrick, I've known for probably now 15 years or so, since her time at Forest Trends, and was writing the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market with Stephen D'Onofrio back in the day. And I caught up with her at COP in Dubai, and we sat down for a really interesting conversation. I mucked up the microphone on that one, so it wasn't a very good episode, I have to say. So I owe her one. But a lot of your colleagues are really, at the forefront in terms of not only the industry, but in terms of knowledge. And so what's it like working there? And then talk to me about the day to day.
Yes. Well, what they say about TNC is people come for the mission, but stay for the people, which is so true. Because it's just actually my very first week at work, almost a decade ago at this point. I really was like, wow, I got to bring my A game. Like these are some of the like
Hmm.
smartest, most
Smartest
passionate,
people ever.
hardworking people. So yeah, incredible place to work. I will say, just because who knows what's going to come out of my mouth. I don't speak for the Nature Conservancy, right? I speak for myself as a scientist that happens to work at the Nature Conservancy.
Good disclaimer. Don't worry. I'm the same.
But actually, what to your question, what we've been working on most heavily now is trying to provide the science that can be that robust foundation underpinning the carbon market. And I think the carbon market is just such an exciting space where we are learning so much so quickly, right? It's like the best of markets, that like innovation, testing, what's working, what's not working. And so it's an exciting space to be doing the science. And it's also exciting because I know that the work we're doing can be directly useful for people who are really trying to get natural climate solutions to scale.
I love that perspective. I'm preaching to the choir, but sometimes I have to reflect sort of the reality on the ground as well. It can be very demoralizing being in a market that has had numerous starts and it stops effectively. The market has been very volatile, certainly over the
Yeah.
last few years. But I do share that sentiment in terms of the voluntary carbon market, as it was referred to and continues to be referred to. But I like calling it the verified carbon market, a
Yes.
nomenclature that I stole of Rich Gilmore from Carbon Growth Partners, has been really the crucible of innovation in and around environmental markets for a very, very long time. And now, even though we're still evolving the state of the art, essentially, there's a lot of lessons that have actually now been adopted in compliance markets. And I think that that's a validation of a lot of the work that people have done. And so, to your point, I don't want folks to be super despondent. The purpose of this platform is really to help to distill this knowledge and share it widely on a broader platform. So
Yeah.
talk to me about where that is today, state of the art in terms of the science.
Sure. Yeah. And the analogy I like to give for the verified carbon market is I have kids. So it's like a toddler learning to walk, right? Like sometimes it face plants, the kid face plants. You don't like throw out the kid, right? You're like,
Yeah.
okay, let's let's learn from that and figure out how to do better going forward. And totally agree that where the verified carbon market goes, so too does the compliance market. All of those lessons are getting learned and operationalized. So what's the state of the art? We have an initiative called Shift CM, which is Science for High Integrity Frameworks to Transform Carbon Markets. I just looked up to make sure I got it right.
That's
Um,
good.
but it's focused on several facets that we know could use some additional love and attention. And that is around better accounting for leakage, using much more data-driven methods for doing that.
Hmm.
It's around what we call optimizing the portfolio. So it's the recognition that there's no perfect solution, right? Like natural climate solutions provide all kinds of co-benefits. They're scalable, they're ready now, but potentially they can't last for thousands of years. Whereas things that are more permanent, quote unquote, are very expensive, not yet ready to scale, right? So what we really need is a portfolio. But then the question is like, okay, what does that ideal portfolio look like? How much of engineered solutions versus natural solutions? How much focus on just driving down fossil fuel use in the first place? Like, what does that balance look like? Um, and then another portion that I'm much more heavily involved in is around durability, trying to do a better job of managing the risks around natural climate
I much
solutions.
prefer that nomenclature, durability,
Yes.
as opposed to permanence, because permanence implies permanent, in possibly long time scales. But we're talking about the binding of CO2 either to minerals or and you're talking about different timescales. And so, like you
Yes.
said, it's this. I had a really interesting conversation. It's a bit of a digression, but hopefully you indulge me. But I had a really great conversation with Frederick Teo, the CEO of Gen Zero, which is Singapore's largest investment vehicle in around decarbonization. And he talked about the addressing this false narrative around binary thoughts
Mm,
in the market, right? And how oftentimes well-intentioned folks frame it as an argument of nature-based versus technology, direct air capture versus, afforestation or, whatever other binaries you want to pick, right? But ultimately, to your point, if you're taking a portfolio theory, you should look at them as complementary. To your point, nothing can be perfect from the outset. It's going to be on its merits, high integrity or lower in terms of integrity, but you can build a portfolio that then complements for certain inefficiencies. Maybe if you're looking for durability across a broader portfolio, and that is the case. But ultimately, they do share the same thing, that they're trying to avoid or remove carbon from the atmosphere, trying to reverse entropy. In the case of DAC, you're doing it through engineered solutions. And then in the case of nature, you're doing it through biological solutions. But they both use catalysts, they both use energy, and they both ultimately end up at the same place, one in woody biomass and the other one in sort of locking up the CO2 with minerals, etc. So back to you, like just what do you think around this kind of false narrative?
I mean, I would mostly just say amen. Like, this is a point that we're making over and over again, that it's not a binary, right? Like there is a range of durabilities that are out there. And oh, by the way, durability is only one of the dimensions that we should be using to evaluate these things. And so that's why we get back to the like portfolio. There's no perfect solution, but they can work together, complement each other. And I have to say, I'm encouraged in that I feel like the like nature versus tech argument is
Mm.
sort of like 2 years ago. I feel
Yeah,
like
it's
I
so played
hear
out.
much more often the sort of this like the recognition that there's a need for a portfolio of solutions. And we do often like to say like the research and development is done on nature, right? Like millions
Yes.
of years
Millions of
have gone
years of
into
proven
photosynthesis.
scientific data.
Yeah, to
Exactly.
that. And if you described it as like, wow, there's this machine that can use sunlight and water and air to like suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it into relatively long-lived stores.
They can do
We're
so
like,
really cheaply,
very cheaply, exactly.
and you don't even have to build it. It builds
It
itself
builds
from
itself.
a
Yeah, it's
genetic blueprint. It's
self-replicating.
amazing.
Yeah, you would be like, "Oh my gosh, like, I wanna invest in this machine," and you're like, "Oh, it's
Yeah,
the tree
exactly.
outside your window," and people are like, "Oh, all right." We take it for granted. So, yes, the portfolio is the way to go, and I did wanna say, actually, we had an article that we just came out, I think yesterday. Maybe you can put a link in the
Yeah, we'll share it in the show notes. What's it
but
called?
it touches on a lot of these things, like the nuance that we need when thinking about the durability of natural climate solutions. And, we're trying to make plans about how to ensure that something will be there in 100 years. And like 100 years, like there's so much that is going to happen over the next 100 years. And
That
that what
company
we
may
really,
not be around in 100 years.
I
Can we
know.
just call out the reality? Like, no one
Yeah.
can plan for that long. I mean, that's more than a human lifetime, to be very frank.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and
yeah,
so I
it's
just
just,
wanted to add that, what I wanted to add is that, forests can last for I don't know, thousands of years, but like trying to guarantee permanence in 100 years when the landscape is going to change so much over that time. And what I worry about most is a missed opportunity. Um,
Mhm.
that we will not use the solutions we have now during critical decades when we're going to face tipping points and it's going to get harder for nature to help us, right? So, like, why not use nature now? Well, we've got these solutions in hand while buying time for these more technological solutions to come online.
Yeah, completely. And it kind of comes back to kind of like this question around perfect versus like useful, right?
Yeah,
I had Steve Swick and Rene on talking about the carbon paradoxes, but it's kind of
yes,
reflective of that, right? It's like this
totally.
perfection paradox, and it's kind of it can be weaponized as an excuse for inaction. And I think oftentimes it's a classic, divide and conquer type of strategy that's persisted throughout humanity. It's certainly in kind of military circles, right? And effectively our sector has been divided for a very long time now, discussing these imperfections. And it's been weaponized against the market. Like you said, it's kind of perverse that these solutions are not being utilized at the scale that they ought to be used at. And the capital is sitting on the sidelines, essentially saying, well, these are not really investable and they're certainly not bankable. Well, we can't really underwrite that risk. And okay, where else do we invest? And it's kind of perverse. So
Yeah.
how do we move beyond? Ultimately, the question is here from a scientific perspective around this perfect versus useful question.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the greatest risk is inaction, that we'll fail to act in a timely manner to stave off the worst of climate change. And I totally hear you. It's very sad that inaction is sometimes the safer thing to do for a company that might want to invest in the voluntary carbon market. And we really need to switch that. From a scientific perspective, basically what we're trying to do is just take away the risks of decisions and make it easier for people to feel good about their investment. So, for example, from the durability work, what we're doing is trying to map risks to forest. I focus on forest from natural disturbances. Because right now, what you have are systems in place are either like you assume like a constant risk across the landscape, like 20% of your carbon is going to get lost, which I don't like that approach because there's no incentive for putting projects in places that are more stable or doing necessary management actions to help reduce the risk. So, how do we show how that risk varies across the landscape and help direct projects towards the places that are more likely to be stable? And then, of course, figure out like how big do we think the risks are going to be under future climate change so that we can build appropriate compensation mechanisms to account for any carbon loss that might occur over the time period of the crediting mechanism.
I like that. So walk me through how that materializes in terms of like either compensation piece, like I'm thinking buffer pools, I'm thinking, how does this all operate in terms of in the real world?
Yes. Well, let's start with buffer pools, but then
Let's start with buffer pools.
there's another piece of work that we have coming out that talks about beyond buffer pools and beyond. So there's
Mhm.
other exciting innovations in the compensation space. But yeah,
I'm
so
keen to hear what
buffer,
you have to say about buffer pools, because can I just do a little bit of an introduction here? I feel like
yes.
it's been a very blunt tool, and I don't think I don't think it's reflective of where the state of the art is today. Right? Insurance is
Mm,
looking around at this, and I always wondered whether, from a governance perspective, the certifying bodies are the best equipped to be managing the buffer pools. So I'm keen to hear how you're framing it.
yes. So buffer pools are the most common mechanism for dealing
Hmm.
with risk. And I do think that there's work to try to have the buffer pools be better informed by the best available science and thinking about, again, what I said, how do risks vary across the landscape and thinking about future climate. Those are often not incorporated into the model. What I see is either just like that flat, like everybody has to take 20% of their credits and set them aside in a buffer pool, which doesn't account for the variation that's out there. Or there's
Yeah,
these really
essentially buffer
sophisticated,
pools are like the version of an insurance reserve for the
right?
market. So like you said, a 20% haircut off the total potential issuance from a project is then held into the reserve, into the buffer pool.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And then there's others where there's these like very complicated systems to try to account for, how well the project is managed, what are sort of external forces that might be influencing carbon storage, like what are all the different natural forces, but like it's a very long and lengthy process that one just takes a whole lot of time for somebody to run through that. They have to like scrape together the science to figure out what their numbers should be. And at the end, you actually don't get that much variation. It's sort of like 10 to 20% credit going to the buffer pool. And what I would love to do is just make it easier for people to say, like, okay, like go to this map, pull the number, and based on the best available science, like that's what we think the buffer pool contribution should be. So that's our goal, is to try to make it easier and faster and more robust to come up with a buffer pool
So
number.
does it take into account in that map? That's really fascinating. Does it take into account the incidence or potential for wildfires or disease or pests or droughts and these sorts of extraneous events? Is that the thesis?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's just for forests and it's just for natural disturbances. So it's exactly what you just said: wildfire, pest disease, drought. And we break it into, this is important, three things. The first is the likelihood of a disturbance, which can be quite frequent, right? Low
Hmm.
fires come through or pest or disease. But then the next one is important, of how much carbon is actually lost, because you can have a fire that comes through and a lot of the carbon is still there, fine. The trees are happy if it's a low severity fire, or a high severity fire where you lose a lot of the carbon. And then the third element that I think just gets forgotten often is how much can the system recover? Because often people act like, poof, a fire came through, like the carbon's gone
Yeah, that's the
forever.
end.
And that's just not
Mm.
how forests work, right? Like they
No,
can regrow. So
mhm.
how quickly does that carbon come back? So we think it's those three pieces, like how likelihood is the fire, how likelihood is the disturbance, how severe is it, and then what's the likelihood and rate of recovery? And putting all that all together would hopefully come up with a better buffer pool contribution.
That's interesting. And then in that in that science, do you make any recommendations around the governance frameworks that will underpin that? Do you still think that they reside? And maybe this is beyond your area of expertise, so tell me if I'm stepping in the wrong direction. But do you think that the standards are the ones that should be administering that buffer pool?
So I am probably not the person to ask about that. There's lots of conversations thinking about, should it be like a government backed buffer pool versus
I keep
the
thinking about
others
insurance
that are doing it.
companies.
And
They've got, I mean, they've got the actuaries and they've got the ability to price that risk. We're having, just for full transparency, I'm having conversations with folks in the insurance industry around the role that they could play to effectively innovate in and around that area. And I think that what could be interesting, I don't know about the viability of this, but effectively, if an insurance company was able to manage that pool, they could also effectively write premiums against it for new projects and essentially also actively manage that pool. So create liquidity in the market that's often lacking. And I think that could be beneficial for the
yeah,
market. So it could win on both sides. But I
I mean,
digress. Okay, so we're talking
no, well, I'll just
technical.
say it's like
Yeah.
where we actually, like, the insurance industry is exactly where we want to go, right? Like, it's not about getting rid of risk, it's about
Mm-hmm.
managing risk. Like, it's
That's what it is.
dangerous to drive our car, but we still all drive our cars. We just create seatbelts, and insurance is there to think about how high your risk might be, right? Like the rate that you
Yeah,
pay depends on where you live, like who you are, what your age is, what's your history. And that's what we need to get to. That would be the goal for like this buffer pool map, is to have like real actuarial data come in and feed back and sort of recalibrate that map based on observed trends. There just is not enough sort of actuarial data at this point for carbon markets to start building that, but that's the dream, to
that's the
really
dream.
use
Okay,
the
well,
insurance model.
so let's set that challenge, and I want to follow up on this conversation with folks in the in the insurance industry to see
Great.
how far they can push it. But to your point, yeah, there are no industries in the world that are absent risk. It is, you're absolutely correct in that point. It's how we manage it. We're seeing it right now in the Strait of Hormuz, that shipping ground to a halt because of the risk essentially of conflict there, and effectively many of the ships were not able to pass because they couldn't have that risk underwritten. So maritime is a perfect sort of corollary for this industry, for carbon markets in particular, where insurance could actually be transformative and enable that participation. Because today it's all or none, right? You purchase a project and maybe there's a reputational risk, maybe there's a reversal risk, or maybe you get called out in the media. It's too difficult, too risky. Sorry, I can't act. And we got to get over that hump of inaction, as we talked about
Yeah.
before, through interesting insurance systems and others.
My sort of like magic wand wish is that if I could wave a magic wand and make a change, is that we don't drag companies that voluntarily invest it through the mud for missteps, but treat those as
Yeah,
opportunities to learn
to
how
learn.
to do better. Because yeah, those where we are learning. That's why the verified carbon market is so exciting. We're learning so much so quickly, and if we could just use it as learning rather than like, oh God, I shouldn't do anything,
Yeah,
that would be my big
I think
wish.
I think that'd be great. I think if we could live in a less polarizing world and have conversations that allowed
Yeah.
for people to recognize that mistakes happen or lessons learned from it, that would be great. I've seen that firsthand with clients that had committed significant pools of capital, had significant resources, devoted lots of time and energy to do right and to make investments into projects that were delivering significant impact, were then picked out in the media because it was a convenient byline, and then ultimately retreat from the market. And those people that had dedicated decade plus of their careers inside that organization were effectively told, you can't keep doing this. It's just, and then the communities that were benefiting from those off takes, et cetera,
Yeah.
over gotcha because some sort of line in media, that's not constructive. That's absolutely destructive, and we need, I completely agree, we need to get away from that. The question is, how do we do this? And I think
I
you're
know.
talking about the solutions, so
Yeah.
let's unpack some of those.
Well, did you want to talk about other compensation mechanisms beyond
Yeah,
buffer pools?
yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
So you already mentioned insurance. There's a paper that will be coming out at some point called Buffers and Beyond. And we divide the different compensation mechanisms into three buckets. The first is risk transfer, where you sort of
Mhm.
are like taking risk, aggregating and bundling across different projects and sort of transferring it to another entity. So buffer pools are one of those. Insurance is another one. But then there's also the carbon trust idea, or the permanence trust fund, if you've heard of that one yet.
I literally had this conversation with an old friend, David Antonioli, who was formerly Vera's CEO, literally the other day, and
Okay.
we've been exchanging emails furiously on this concept. Please share it for our audience in terms of how that works.
So it's not that different from the buffer pool. The way I like to describe it is that instead of the credits being sort of set in reserve and sort of stored on the land, you sell the credits sort of whenever they're ready, and then you take that money and you put it into a financial trust that will grow through time. So instead of growing carbon on the ground, you're growing money in a bank. And then that money is there if there is a reversal to make up for any reversal that happens. The nice thing about that is it gives flexibility. So you could decide to buy some additional like forest credits if you want to,
Hmm.
or potentially engineered solutions and credits have really dropped in price at that point, and so you want to transition to purchasing those credits to make up for it. So there's a pilot right now that's being run by American Forest Foundation and KEDA, which is insurance, to figure out like, okay, what would this trust need to look like? What's the rate of return to keep it viable? Like who would run this institution? So it's still an idea that has idea or parts that need to be worked out. But these are the things that excite me, that there's these innovations happening in the market and trying to think, how can we do things beyond just buffer pools? So those are the risk transfer. I can talk about the other ones if you want to, the other buckets.
Can I just reflect on the trust or
Sure.
endowment kind of concept? So I had Nathan Truitt on.
Oh
We
yeah,
didn't
thanks.
discuss that on. And Nate's amazing, super intelligent person. Again, and like you said, people come for the mission, but they stay for the people. I totally resonate with that thesis. Every single person I've met within forestry that is just so passionate, and so intelligent. Nate's one of those people. But it's and Natalia over at Kita, and I love the work that they're doing. So that's a really interesting concept. I won't steal David's thunder, but he's willing. But he's thinking about how to take that beyond and asking the question, what happens to the project after the crediting period ends?
Hmm.
Right? And extending that concept of the trust to provide protection for that project, essentially in perpetuity. And it's these endowments, these trusts exist in the real world, right? And around protecting for generational wealth, but also for systems and certain, certain aspects of our society that need to be preserved long term. And so it's taking a certain pool of capital, growing that over time, and continuously redistributing
Yeah,
the yield essentially back into worthwhile activities. I like that approach around that redistribution, so that if there is an adverse event, you have a recourse essentially through this trust in order
exactly.
to address for those claims essentially that are underwritten on the projects
Exactly.
themselves. It's a pretty eloquent model. The question is going to be, how do you structure the trust? Ultimately, you would expect that it would be invested in uncorrelated asset classes, so that if the carbon market volatility goes the wrong way, essentially you're essentially hedged. But the financial markets are very sophisticated. I'm sure that there's much smarter people that are thinking about this.
I'm a carbon accountant, not a financial accountant, so
Yeah, same.
I'll leave it to those that think in those spaces. But you're right. Like there are analogies out there. It seems like it could be doable.
Good. Okay, so we've got buffer pools, insurance, the
Yep.
trusts.
Trust. Those
Those
are
were the
all the
three, right?
risk transfer ones. Then
Risk
there's
transfer.
purchasing strategies. So something
Okay.
like vertical stacking, where you buy sort of more than you need upfront to try to anticipate what you think the losses might be, and then you just don't worry about it because you've sort of over purchased initially to count for some loss. Or
We've been
horizontal
advocating
stacking.
for that for ages.
Yeah.
Honestly, I won't mention a fund that we advised a long time ago on this concept, but they said essentially, why not build your own buffer pool? Essentially, if your target is 100%, why not buy 120 or 115%, and then just carry that 20% into the next year's purchasing and just buy another 100 every single year, so that and as your emissions start to come down, you'll need less and less and less and less, essentially. And so what if you're over purchased?
Yeah.
Especially
So
in
what
the
if you
early days of,
face?
yeah,
You
it's a
you
little bit extra
push back
cash,
for that one, or
but ultimately, like, the prices they're going to work in your benefit. Because if you think about
right?
over time, if there's a natural contango where the prices start to increase over
Yeah.
time, as emission reductions become harder and harder and harder, and there's more and more competition for the underlying instruments out there, then prices go up and to the right. And so
Yeah.
in their thesis, it was like, why is this people not doing this? It's a no-brainer. The market just hasn't supported it for a lack of liquidity. But I hope that when the liquidity comes back, that a astute manager of their emissions inventory can conceive that
Yeah.
concept
Yeah.
internally. How do we standardize that? How do we make it, sort of standard practice?
I mean, so what we're this is like the annoying scientist answer. I never try to tell anybody what they should do because I think, like, who am I in Washington, D.C. to say you should do this? What we present is a menu of options and present
Hmm.
the pluses and minuses of them, and then put it out into the world for other decision makers to be like, you know what, I think like vertical stacking is really going to work for our context for all of the reasons that you just said, Renee.
So then
Or
we need
buffer
leaders. So
poles.
the answer is we need people to demonstrate leadership. That's what's sorely lacking in this world.
You think
I
a
think so.
lag a leader? I have no idea how to answer that.
Just leave it alone. Don't worry about it. I'm not trying to lure you into a political discourse. No. It's not. I'm not setting traps. Let's just move on.
We definitely need we definitely need bravery, a willingness to work in a messy, complex space to try to make our best available decisions and learn from
Mhm.
it and do better and admit when we screwed up and just say that's okay and keep going. There's another one if you want to talk about
Yeah.
So this one probably will not surprise you, but there's vertical stacking, then there's horizontal stacking. So where you commit to purchase anew once your crediting period has ended or there's a reversal and you just want to purchase some more. That one, it may be potentially harder because you, as the buyer, have to carry the liability on your books for sort of continuing to do that purchasing over time. But it can allow you to transition your portfolio from like whatever's available now to what might be available going forward. So that's another one, another purchasing type strategy. And then our third bucket of that, other than risk transfer purchasing, are accounting strategies. And that's where you try to build a portfolio that's sort of risk adjusted to like,
Yeah.
some things that are riskier but cheaper and things that are expensive but less risky to have more of a sort of overall portfolio goal. Or what is time weighted accounting, where it's basically
Okay.
how you change your accounting system to build time directly into that. So ton-year accounting is one of those examples.
So how does
Last,
that work in practice? Because ultimately, coming back to something you said earlier, which is this urgency, right? That we should be feeling because the climate science is telling us that this decade is a critical decade, and we're approaching the end of this decade. So am I right in thinking that the short-term impacts that we can achieve today have a significant benefit long term? And think about this bathtub analogy that keeps popping up, right? Around turning off the tap first before we start to scoop the water out effectively of the bathtub. Essentially, our atmospheric concentration of CO2 is increasing constantly through our voracious appetite for hydrocarbons and the burning of them. So how does that accounting sort of take that, or does it take it into account around the short term benefits of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere or avoiding the emissions in the first place today, not in a decade?
Yeah, well, I also love the bathtub analogy, which I usually use in the context of everyone loves removals, but like avoided emissions. It's
Yeah.
usually like in the forest space is more cost, biodiversity, and carbon effective to keep it standing in the forest than try to regrow it after the fact. If
We
you're an
should be doing both.
overflowing bathtub, you should be turning off the tap. But yes, both.
Yeah.
We do need both. But and you're absolutely right. Like what I often worry about are tipping points,
Hmm.
peak temperature. Those are more in sort of the shorter term, right? Like the next few decades are going to be instrumental for seeing like just how bad are we going to go before we manage to start driving down global CO2 levels and temperature. So there's a great study that's out there by Damon Matthews where he put together this scenario of temporary storage.
Hmm.
And what it is that there's a whole bunch of reforestation that happens. And after 30 years, the trees stop growing, which never happens, right? Like at 30 years is usually when the trees are really like taken off. But in this scenario, like no more carbon. After 30 years, they've gotten what they were going to get. And then they start to slowly lose carbon over time, like they all die. And after 70 years, poof, they're gone, which again doesn't happen, right? It's like an extreme
Yeah.
temporary scenario. But even in that case, if we have just moderate climate action, like reducing fossil fuel, that temporary storage buys us time. It gives us like a decade in which to do additional action. So it can help buy us time. If it's coupled with like really committed fossil fuel emissions reduction, it reduces peak warming. So even temporary storage can be hugely useful to either buy us time if we're not doing a ton around climate change, and if we're doing a ton to tackle climate change writ large, it can reduce peak warming, and every fraction of a degree matters, right? So, 1.6 is worse than 1.5, 1.7 is much, much worse than 1.6, 1.8 is much, 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 much worse. Like every fraction of a degree matters. Yes, even temporary storage can be valuable.
Okay. And so can I bring it to the scientific sort of update? Because we keep seeing the warming trends, right? And we look at it through corollaries like sea ice, and we look at actual atmospheric concentrations of CO2, and then hottest years on record. And essentially, there's that very famous chart around the blue bars and then concentration of red bars stacked to the right. What's the status right now in terms of the real world reality in terms of warming?
We will likely exceed 1.5. But that shouldn't, there's still like keep 1.5 alive. How much of an overshoot over 1.5, I think, is the question. now
Mm.
and then get to that point of like every fraction of a degree matters. I did to like not have a downer note here. The thing that I often like to keep in mind is where we were going to be before climate action started in earnest, right? And we were
Yeah.
at like 8 degrees of warming, right? So we're not doing that anymore. We've
Yeah.
already succeeded. We've already partly won the battle, but there's still a long ways to go to stay as close to 1.5 warming before we turn the dial back as much as
Yeah.
possible.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I love that positive approach. I'm a glass half full type of person as well. It's important to definitely see the progress that we have made, but when we look at the actual emissions curve, it's not like we're breaking its back, right? All the projections were that, yeah, in the 2030s, we start to, in the 2020s, I should say, in the 2030s, we start to come down pretty significantly. And although it's not business as usual, it hasn't ratcheted down in a sort of a very significant way. In fact, it's probably more just kind of same as kind of a current peak. But that brings into question the continuous burning of fossil fuels leading into the atmosphere. Ultimately, nature plays such a significant role. I'll bring it back to nature, right? You've got forests and oceans playing such a significant role as carbon sinks. But ultimately, they're helping to prevent us crossing, into that warmer territory. Like you said, the upper bands, 1.6, 1.7, essentially. But there's always a risk, essentially, of tipping points in the planetary system. I remember, just looking it up here, the Stockholm Resilience Center, publishing the planetary boundaries, and that's always a scary report to read. Looking at various different boundaries. I think we're 9 out of 10 or 12 that are in excess right now. It's not painting a pretty picture, is the reality. I guess, bring it to from a positive lens and kind of back to your work, the role of nature, keep that's your center of expertise. How do we scale the protection of nature, and then coming back to where we began the conversation around afforestation and reforestation? How do we incentivize for more and more of those degraded ecosystems to start to come back to help us to sequester carbon and do so at scale?
Yes, I recently just had to give a talk where it was like, okay, how do we solve like the problems around getting a forest to scale as climate solution? And I was like, okay, not, not a small question. But the
Not a
things
small
that
question.
that I am doing specifically is around narrowing the decision space, right? Like we can't do everything everywhere. And we don't have the time or resources, or seedlings to waste on projects that aren't ultimately going to work. So, like, how do we narrow the decision space to the places that we think are going to be most likely to succeed? And so that's places like where are the locations where we can get the greatest climate mitigation per hectare of investment, and sort of what are the actions to getting that. So we have a platform called Nature where you can actually draw your own polygon on a map, or you can click to the level of a county and it'll say like, here's your menu of natural climate solutions that can work in this location.
What
And
was it
that
called? Nature base?
nature base. Yeah, www.naturebase.org, where we put together all the best available science to try to have our increasingly refined estimates of where the places and actions that are going to be most impactful. And then the other sort of step is to try to help people make faster and more robust decisions. So that's things like nature-based, like helping to create tools that help people make decisions about what they might want to do. Or within our Shift CM work, like trying to build a buffer pool map that allows people to just get, their buffer pool number. So helping them feel better about those decisions. And then the third thing I think we need to do is just really like learn. And you can learn by seeing what has already happened, what
Mm-hmm.
worked, what didn't work, and why, and make sure that future projects stand on the shoulders of those that came before. But another thing I would love to see happening is like learning built deliberately into project design, like implementation as experimentation. Like we are setting up projects in ways that allow us to like learn how we can really do the next project even better.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, so it's accretive over time.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so those lessons don't get forgotten. We don't keep repeating the past. Essentially, we learn from it and we continuously improve
That's
over
right.
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's what all humanity should aspire to do. But we keep
Yeah.
repeating the mistakes of the past. Okay, walk me through essentially how, we'll put it in the show notes as well. Lots of stuff to share with with our audience following our conversation. So thanks, Susan. So on the naturebased .org platform, you can look at you said you could enter in your polygon, but you could look at the global map and effectively start to see the areas that could yield the greatest impact. Is that
That's right.
Is that accurate? Okay.
Yeah.
And so
So you could
how
just
is that calculated? Through rainfall or like historical, what forest cover? What are the sort of parameters that go into shaping that?
Well, so the nice thing about natural climate solutions is it spans multiple ecosystems in action.
Mm-hmm.
So it's protection of existing ecosystems, improved management of working lands or restoration. And then it's forest, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands. And so the methods to figure out what the mitigation potential would be really differs depending on sort of like what type of action you're looking at. But we've got it
Okay.
all documented if you want to delve into it, and there's often a peer-reviewed publication. I can give you an example for reforestation if that would be helpful
Yeah,
to
that would be
looking
great.
at.
I think examples are how we learn. Great.
Yes. So for reforestation mitigation potential, roughly it's calculated as like how much carbon are you going to get per hectare of investment, per acre of
Mm-hmm.
investment, and where the heck are you going to put all the trees? And we've done a ton of work on both the like how much carbon can you get and where you're going to put the trees. How much carbon you're going to get is often taking a bunch of field data. Like we've scoured through thousands of publications to find examples of people going out and measuring carbon in the field. And
Mm-hmm.
then we combine those with predictors, like you mentioned, like temperature, precipitation, rainfall, soil types, to develop like a wall to wall map of how much carbon you could get from letting a forest regrow or from setting up a plantation or an agroforestry system. And then the areas, like where you're going to put all the trees, is based on um, a global map that we put together with trepidation and humility, because whenever there's a global reforestation map, people get angry. But we
Sure.
worked with some of the most prominent critics to like, okay, what are all of the things, again, learning that were wrong about past reforestation opportunity maps? How can we do better? And so it's like finding the places that we think are definitely forest suitable, not suggesting that we pack a bunch of trees into native grasslands. It's bad for biodiversity. Trees probably won't live
Mm-hmm.
into account places where there's actually plenty of trees already. We just couldn't see them because they were too scattered. Taking into account things like there are people that live on that land and they may not have secure tenure. And do we really want to suggest taking away that land to put it back into forest and disempower the people that have lived there forever? Um, so building all of that into a map that tries to say like, okay, once you've figured out where are the best places based on carbon, biodiversity of people to do reforestation, and that's what's shown in nature-based, that sort of underlying map plus the
That's great. And so who do you envisage will utilize this tool? Because like all tools, they can provide the leverage, but only if you know how to use them, but also who do you want to find this tool?
I think they're best used as bright spots on a map of the
Mm-hmm.
places where there's high potential. So a country level decision maker might say like, okay, we're thinking of expanding, if they're interested in reforestation or improved cropland, we can say like, these are the places in this broader geography where we think there's the most opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
That then you can focus sort of attention, resources, conversations with the local community to figure out what are the types of decisions that you might want to do. It could even be, we found it useful for individual philanthropists that are trying to think about where might they want to invest their limited climate finance in places that are most likely to be impactful. And it's also useful, I think, for scientist implementers who are then saying like, okay, like there's a ton of potential in India. Like now we're going to go and work specifically within the Indian context to refine our
Mm-hmm.
estimates to really hone in on the exact places where we think it makes most sense.
Great. So it's a combination ultimately. You reference essentially governments, like obviously capital allocators, whether that's philanthropic capital or other sort of at-risk capital. So entrepreneurs, project developers that are putting capital at risk, effectively, ultimately leveraging this tool to identify where the best outcomes could ultimately be realized. And then they've obviously got to overlay the opportunity with the
That's
reality
right.
in the
That's right.
world. Yeah, that's
Exactly.
great. Cool. That's really exciting. I was not aware of it, so thanks for sharing that
Oh,
with me.
hey,
That's really really cool. And I'll put that in the show notes because I think people could geek out over that one. That's quite.
it is fun. You can turn a bunch of things on and off, and
Yeah, I
we've got a
bet.
really
I
great web
bet.
designer who made it really easy to use.
Good. So Susan, just conscious of time, but we've had a pretty wide ranging
Oh
conversation.
yeah.
I
Oh, I
guess.
gotta go.
Yeah. So I guess just final kind of question: where would where's your sense of optimism, and what's next for you at NTNC? I've got a bunch of other questions, but I'll invite you back for another conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for giving me a chance to share. I think my sense of optimism really just comes in knowing that I am one in part of a much larger community of scientists,
Mm-hmm.
of market actors, of people within the corporate sector, within governments who are all leaning in and pushing towards a better climate future, and collectively we'll be able to do something great, I'm sure. And we are learning so fast within the verified carbon market that it does really feel like we are running towards something. Not fast enough, but we're getting faster day by day.
Great. I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Susan. I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot, and I'd love to invite you back another time. I'll let you on to your next meeting, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Renee. It was so great.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Bye.